It all started with a text. "Hey, Mike, can you bring the red toolbox tomorrow? The leak's getting worse." I didn't know a Mike, and I certainly didn't own a red toolbox. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something about the message intrigued me. It felt urgent, almost desperate. So, I replied, "Sorry, I think you've got the wrong number. Hope you get the leak fixed." What I didn't expect was a response back almost immediately. "Oh, I'm so sorry. My bad. Thanks anyway." I thought that was the end of it. But the next day, as I was taking out the trash, I heard something that made my ears perk up, a faint but distinct sound of water dripping, coming from my neighbor's house. My neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, was an older woman who kept to herself. She'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone could remember, but she rarely spoke to anyone beyond a polite nod. Her house was a little rundown, with peeling paint and a lawn that hadn't been mowed in weeks. The sound of water seemed to be coming from her side yard, and curiosity got the better of me. I walked closer and saw that her outdoor faucet was leaking badly, creating a small puddle in the dirt below. I hesitated. Should I knock on her door and let her know? Would she even appreciate the intrusion? Before I could decide, the door creaked open, and there she was, staring at me with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Hi, Mrs. Callahan. Sorry to bother you, but I noticed your faucet is leaking. Thought you might want to know." She glanced at the faucet and sighed. "That thing's been giving me trouble for weeks. I've been meaning to fix it," but she trailed off, her face softening. "Thank you for letting me know." That small interaction could have been the end of it, but something about Mrs. Callahan stayed on my mind. She seemed lonely, almost defeated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she might need help. A few days later, I decided to check in on her. I brought over some cookies as an excuse and knocked on her door. To my surprise, she invited me in. Her house was like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was dated but well kept, and the walls were lined with black and white photos of what I assumed were her family. One photo caught my eye, a younger Mrs. Callahan standing next to a man in a military uniform, both of them beaming with pride. "That's my husband, Richard," she said, noticing my gaze. "He passed away years ago." I offered my condolences, and she smiled faintly. "He was a good man. Always took care of things around here. I guess I haven't been doing a great job keeping up with it all since he's been gone." Over the next few weeks, I started helping Mrs. Callahan with small tasks around the house. Fixing the leaky faucet turned into mowing her lawn, replacing a broken light fixture, and eventually sitting down for tea and listening to her stories. She told me about her life, how she and Richard had moved into the house right after the war, how they dreamed of traveling the world together, and how those dreams had been cut short when Richard was diagnosed with cancer. One day, while we were organizing some old boxes in her attic, I stumbled upon something unusual, a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. They looked old, their edges yellowed with time. "Are these yours?" I asked, holding them up. Mrs. Callahan's face went pale. "I haven't seen those in years," she whispered, her voice trembling. The letters were from Richard, written while he was deployed overseas. As we read through them together, a picture of their love story emerged, a story of sacrifice, longing, and unwavering devotion. But one letter stood out. In it, Richard mentioned something I hadn't expected, a child. "I can't wait to meet our little one," he wrote. "I'm going to be the best dad, I promise." I looked at Mrs. Callahan, confused. "You had a child?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "We did," she said softly. "But he was taken from us. It's complicated." She explained that their son, Thomas, had been born with a severe heart condition. He'd passed away before his first birthday, a loss so devastating that she and Richard rarely spoke of it, even to each other. After that day, something changed in Mrs. Callahan. She seemed lighter, as if sharing her story had lifted a weight she'd carried for decades. Word of my visits must have spread through the neighborhood because soon, others started reaching out to her as well. People brought her meals, helped with repairs, and invited her to community events. Mrs. Callahan, who had once been the neighborhood recluse, became its heart. Looking back, it's amazing to think how a wrong number text set everything in motion. It led me to a woman who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. It brought our community together in ways I never expected. Sometimes, the smallest things, a text, a leaky faucet, an old letter, can create ripples that change lives. And for Mrs. Callahan, and for me, those ripples turned into something truly beautiful. Second story. It started with a LinkedIn notification. A recruiter had reached out for a position I wasn't actively seeking, but seemed promising. It was for a mid-level project manager role at a startup downtown. I wasn't unhappy in my current job, but I'd been feeling stagnant for a while, so I thought, why not? I replied to the message, scheduled an interview, and that Friday, I found myself sitting in a minimalist, glass-walled office, waiting to be called in. The first hint that something was off came when the receptionist approached me. "Mr. Tanner," she asked, looking at her tablet with a slight frown. "That's me," I replied. She hesitated. "Your interview was scheduled for 10 a.m., but we had someone else under that time slot as well. We'll sort this out shortly." "My apologies." I checked my phone, it was 10:05. No big deal. Scheduling conflicts happen. But as I waited, I couldn't help noticing another man sitting a few chairs away. Late 30s, a tailored suit, an expensive-looking watch, and the air of someone who didn't want to be kept waiting. After about 15 minutes, the receptionist came back. "Mr. Tanner," she said, a bit flustered. "Could you please step into conference room B? We'll have someone with you shortly." I followed her directions, but when I entered the room, I realized it wasn't empty. The man I'd noticed earlier, the tailored suit guy, was already seated inside. He glanced up from his phone, looking equally confused. "Are you here for the same interview?" I asked, taking the chair opposite him. "I think so," he replied, narrowing his eyes. "They called me in, then told me to wait here." Strange process. We exchanged polite nods, but didn't say much else. The awkwardness was palpable. About 5 minutes later, a young woman with a clipboard came in. Her face was flushed, and she looked frazzled. "Gentlemen," she began, "I owe you both an explanation. There was a mix-up with scheduling, and we accidentally double-booked this interview slot. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Before either of us could respond, she continued, "We'd like to conduct the interviews back-to-back, but if either of you has a hard stop, please let us know." I was fine waiting, but the other guy, who introduced himself as Nathan, insisted he'd been promised the slot first. It turned into a mildly tense exchange, which the woman tried to diffuse by offering coffee and reassurances. Eventually, Nathan went first, leaving me alone in the room. As I waited, I started browsing through the folder I'd brought, reviewing my notes and answers to potential questions. That's when I noticed something odd. My name was misspelled on the printed interview schedule inside the folder they'd handed me. It wasn't just a typo, it was a completely different last name. Turner instead of Tanner. Curiosity piqued, I decided to dig deeper. On the back of the schedule was a list of candidates, my name wasn't on it at all. But there was a Michael Turner scheduled for 10 a.m. Was I in the wrong place? Before I could figure it out, Nathan came back in, looking annoyed. "Good luck," he said curtly, brushing past me. The same woman returned and ushered me into a different room. The interview itself was standard, questions about my experience, problem-solving skills, leadership qualities. But halfway through, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling about the mix-up with my name. Finally, I brought it up. "Sorry to interrupt," I said, "but I noticed a mistake on the schedule. My last name isn't Turner, it's Tanner. Is that going to be an issue?" The interview frowned and exchanged a glance with the other pain list. "One moment," she said, leaving the room abruptly. I sat there, nerves on edge. What was going on? When she came back, she was holding 2 files. "Mr. Tanner," she said, her tone cautious. "I think there's been some confusion. These files were mixed up. You weren't the intended candidate for today's interview." I blinked. "What?" "We scheduled Michael Turner for this time slot," she explained. "But it seems there was an error, and your information was sent to us instead. We weren't expecting you, but," she paused. "Since you're already here, we decided to proceed." My mind raced. Had the recruiter made a mistake? Had I shown up to an interview that wasn't even meant for me? Instead of panicking, I decided to lean into it. I answered the remaining questions with confidence, highlighting my skills and experiences. I figured I had nothing to lose. They weren't expecting me anyway. When the interview ended, the panelists thanked me for my time but didn't give any indication of whether they'd consider me for the role. A week later, I got an email from the recruiter. "Congratulations, Mr. Tanner. The team was impressed with your interview, and they'd like to extend an offer." I was stunned. Not only had I landed the job, but I'd done so by sheer coincidence. Over the next few months, I learned more about the startup's culture and the people I'd be working with. One day, during a casual conversation with my manager, I brought up the mix-up. He laughed. "Honestly, we think it was fate. The candidate we were supposed to interview that day didn't show up. But you did. And you were exactly what we needed." Sometimes, life throws you a curveball. What started as a scheduling mistake turned into an opportunity that reshaped my career and taught me that even the strangest situations can lead to incredible outcomes. Third story. It started like any other Tuesday. I was sitting at my usual corner table in a local coffee shop, typing away on my laptop. The baristas knew my order by heart, an Americano with just a splash of oat milk, and the place had become my go-to spot for work and unwinding. The morning rush had dwindled, leaving the shop in a comfortable lull. I was deep into editing a presentation for a client when someone cleared their throat beside me. "Excuse me," a man's voice said. I looked up to see a guy in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, holding a laptop bag and looking a little frazzled. He wore a slightly wrinkled dress shirt, and his tie was askew. "Sorry to bother you," he continued, "but could I borrow your phone charger for a few minutes? Mine's dead, and I've got a meeting in 10. Normally, I'd hesitate. I'm not the type to lend things to strangers, especially expensive electronics. But something about his desperate, almost apologetic demeanor made me pause. "Sure," I said, unplugging my charger from the outlet by my table and handing it over. Relief washed over his face. "Thank you so much. I'll bring it right back, I promise." He plugged his phone in at the nearest table and began frantically typing on his laptop. A few minutes passed, and I was back to focusing on my work when he returned the charger with a grateful smile. "Thanks again," he said. "You just saved me from a disaster of a morning." "No problem," I replied, already turning back to my screen. But instead of walking away, he hesitated. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I looked up again, mildly annoyed but curious. "Are you a designer or something? I noticed your screen when I walked up." "I'm a freelance graphic designer," I admitted. "Why?" His eyes lit up. "No way. I've been looking for someone to help with a project. Do you have a card or portfolio I could check out?" Normally, I wouldn't entertain a conversation like this. Coffee shops are for working or relaxing, not networking. But something about the coincidence struck me. I reached into my bag and handed him one of my business cards. "I'm Alex, by the way," he said, pocketing the card. "I work in marketing. We're revamping our branding, and I think your style could be a great fit." "Nice to meet you, Alex," I replied. "Feel free to reach out." Honestly, I didn't think much of it. People promise things all the time and never follow through. I went back to my day, finishing my work and leaving the coffee shop without giving the encounter another thought. 2 days later, I got an email. The subject line read, "Potential project opportunity." It was Alex. He introduced himself more formally and explained that he worked for a growing tech startup. They needed a freelance designer for a series of marketing materials, and he wanted to know if I was interested. The timing was perfect. I had just wrapped up a big project and had room in my schedule. After a quick back and forth, we set up a meeting. When I arrived at their office, I was impressed. The startup was clearly thriving, open floor plans, modern decor, and a team of energetic, driven people buzzing around. Alex introduced me to his boss, Megan, who immediately dove into the specifics of what they needed. The project turned out to be more extensive than I'd anticipated. They didn't just want marketing materials, they needed an entire rebrand. Logos, color schemes, social media templates, the works. I know it's a lot, Megan said, but Alex speaks highly of you, and your portfolio is solid. Think you can handle it? I said yes without hesitation. What followed was one of the most intense, rewarding months of my career. The project pushed me creatively and professionally, but it also opened doors I hadn't expected. Megan referred me to 2 other companies, and Alex became one of my most reliable clients, sending more work my way every few months. But the real impact wasn't just professional, it was personal. During one of our late-night work sessions, Alex and I got to talking about how we ended up in our respective fields. He shared how he'd left a high-paying corporate job to join the startup because he wanted to create something meaningful. That coffee shop morning, he said, was one of those moments where everything aligned. I almost didn't go in. My meeting wasn't even nearby, but I needed Wi-Fi, so I stopped there on a whim. If I hadn't, we wouldn't be sitting here now. I laughed. Funny, I almost didn't lend you my charger. Guess we both got lucky. That conversation stuck with me. It made me realize how small, seemingly insignificant decisions can lead to profound changes. Lending my charger didn't just save Alex's morning, it kickstarted a chain of events that boosted my career, introduced me to new people, and taught me the value of saying yes to unexpected opportunities. Now, every time I walk into that coffee shop, I can't help but smile. It's a reminder that life is full of possibilities, you just have to be open to them.